part of a larger series we have underway called the Future City Sessions. There are, oh, I forgot, I don't need them. There are 5 altogether. We had a Future City session back in September on big data and the way that data affects cities. And then in February, right winter, we had a session on climate resilience and variability and the way that we adapt to changing seasons, especially when opening day has to happen in a snowstorm or whatever's going on out there today. Tonight is the 3rd session on urban development and design. I'll introduce Marc Norman momentarily. The next session coming up will be in the summer on age-friendly cities. We have a visiting speaker coming from New York, Matthias Holwich, and also one of our faculty members at Kent State, Maggie Calkins, who's been doing research into dementia-friendly cities and how we can adapt cities so that people can live independently, even with cognitive impairments. And then the series will wrap up in October with a session on Great Lakes city issues. There's going to be a publication of a new book called The Third Coast Atlas, and one of the editors of that book, Charles Waldheim, will be here to lead that session. So in addition to sort of trying to spark interesting conversations, which is part of the goal of this work, the other thing that we're really trying to do is figure out how to bring new ideas into practice. As many of you know, the Cleveland Urban Design Collaborative is a nonprofit urban design practice, and so we're always looking for new ideas that we can incorporate into our work to help make us more relevant and more useful to our community partners, who include Cleveland Neighborhood Progress and Downtown Cleveland Alliance and Greater Cleveland Partnership, many of those organizations represented here tonight. So tonight we're especially excited to have Marc Norman here. Marc Norman has dedicated his career, before I do that, I should mention the most important thing, which is this whole series has been brought to you by the generous support of the Gunn Foundation. Without the Gunn Foundation, we wouldn't be able to do any of this, so I just wanted to make sure and express my gratitude. So onto that, I want to just introduce Marc briefly and then turn the presentation over to him. He's dedicated his career to finding remedies to inequality and promoting economic development and social justice through innovative financial strategies and in conjunction with community development and design. He's the director of UPSTATE, which is a design center that's part of Syracuse University. They work on urban design, real estate, and research. And currently, he has a Loeb Fellowship at Harvard, where he's surveying best practices in finance and design. And he aims to create a social innovation fund that will promote smart, progressive, and holistic approaches to building a more equitable urban world. So with that, I will ask you to join me in welcoming Marc Norman.
Can people hear me in the back? Yes? Oh, good. So I don't need to necessarily use the mic. Well, I'm very happy to be here. I've never been to Cleveland before, and I've gotten a little bit of a tour, but not nearly enough. But I know it from the innovative work that's been happening here at University Circle, and of course the work of the Urban Design Collaborative. And there are a lot of sort of overlaps between the work I did in Syracuse and the work that gets done here. And I think there are a lot of parallels in the city, although Cleveland is much bigger. And I think it has, in some ways, had a lot more success with the downtown, but some of the same issues in the neighborhoods. So I'm going to talk about some of the projects that happened at UPSTATE, but I'll sort of weave in other things I've done. I feel pretty lucky to have worked at a number of different places. I got a planning degree at the UCLA School of Architecture, and after that worked for a nonprofit housing development corporation called Skid Row Housing Trust in LA. And I really wanted to find sites for them and figure out furniture layouts and figure out ways that we could engage with the residents, but I spent all my time trying to finance these very difficult SRO, single room occupancy hotels for formerly homeless individuals. And so what that led to was me moving to New York and starting to work with one of the funders we had. Starting to work with one of the funders that was a big part of our work at Skid Row Housing Trust, which was LISC, Local Initiative Support Corporation. So from there, I did equity investing, so helping investors put money into affordable housing projects. That led me to Lehman Brothers, and it wasn't my fault. I was on the affordable housing side. I wasn't on the mortgage-backed security side. But we were doing lending and investing to affordable housing there. After that, DuVernay and Brooks helped cities plan for their vacant land and also helped housing authorities do public housing revitalizations. I went back to the investment banking side, this time doing kind of triple bottom line investing. So with Deutsche Bank looking at projects that brought in an economic return, a social return, but also didn't harm the environment, hopefully didn't harm the environment, hopefully helped mitigate climate change, and then to Upstate. So at Deutsche Bank, most of the work was in New York, but some of it was international, doing relatively big projects. And I think New York City is a kind of unique animal, and it's great to work there, but that's not how most of the country works. So when we did projects like this project up in Harlem, there were many different partners. And it wasn't an easy deal to do. It was reintegrating people coming out of prison. It was supportive housing, transitional housing, and market rate housing. But we had lots of partners. So we had the Jonathan Rose Company, who acted as a third-party developer. The mayor put in money. Back when we had Bloomberg, if there was a gap in housing, sometimes he would just write a check, which he did in this case. The New York State Housing Community Renewal, the law firm, JP Morgan Chase, Deutsche Bank. So lots of partners, probably 14 sources of capital to get this deal done. But it got done. And it was really expensive. But it worked really well in a lot of different ways. I think the design worked really well. We integrated an existing convent that had been on the site since the 1800s with the new building. The neighbors actually came out to the city council to support it, which doesn't usually happen. So those were, I think, good precedents that aren't really applicable anyplace else, but it was a good project. The other thing is we got a lot of affordable housing built. So at Deutsche Bank, we were a funder in a rezoning that happened. And this is sort of, I wanted to show this just to get to issues of Cleveland and Syracuse and other cities that are trying to figure out a way to move forward with sort of equitable development and affordable housing. In this deal, this is a formerly manufacturing area. It was rezoned for 40-story towers. It was rezoned from basically light to heavy manufacturing to residential, and the requirement was you needed to do 25% affordable, which is great, and it targeted people all the way down to 30% of the median income, which is about $18,000 to $22,000 a year, up to 80%. That worked because you had those market rate towers. And I don't know if you've heard about this issue around the poor door. So the poor door is, I don't want to mess this up with the pointer, but this building is all affordable, and that building is all unaffordable, the two towers. And they're separated. But we got 220 units of housing, so there was this kind of dilemma that came up, like should those units all be together in the same building? The problem is that the condos there sell for anywhere from $600,000 to $1.8 million, and cost about $700,000 a unit to construct. So there are dilemmas there. But what the city did was it gave an inclusionary housing bonus. So more affordable means more building. So the developer gets to build 10 more stories if the developer includes more affordable housing. This only really works in a market where 40-story towers with condos selling for 1 to 1.8 million works. So it was great working on these deals, but when you look at the rest of the country and even other parts of the city, it doesn't really work so well. Not to mention the subsidies. So even just to get the affordable housing, you had a variety of subsidies just to get that done. And the whole development got a tax break. So these market rate condo owners that paid 1.5 million also get a 10-year tax break. So that really got me thinking about how do we actually create housing without all of these incentives? How do we, as designers or planners, design policies to make developments that are more equitable and maybe where we have a little bit more agency? This is a very developer-driven project. So in going to upstate, I moved more to an academic role, but kept those same relationships. So I was on the side where I could think about these issues, but still work with the developers, the lenders, and the city agencies to try to see how these deals worked with a variety of partners. So many cities across the Great Lakes, I guess what we now call legacy cities. Sounds much better than Rust Belt. This is Syracuse, but you could substitute it for Cleveland or Youngstown or Buffalo or Rochester, had all of these assets. And I came across this, which was great, which is all the things that were made in Syracuse. Of course, what you'll notice is almost all of them have an end date, which is part of the problem. So jobs really left along with the manufacturing. It didn't fall as much as other cities, but it really was a pretty major industrial powerhouse in its day. This is where I live now, and these are all still existing, these companies. So very different problems come from that moment. So it's not all great in the Bay Area. This, as you know, as you've heard, creates many problems too, but it's kind of the modern day Syracuse or Cleveland. So unfortunately, as those businesses declined, we made some pretty bad decisions. This also could be just about anywhere in a certain region. The regional shopping mall, the interstate highway, lots of demolition, lots of sprawl within the city. But there were also assets. And so we also had the kind of eds and meds leading to a kind of recovery and a downtown renaissance of sorts. But there was this fundamental problem, which is we couldn't really get affordable housing built. So this is just a very simple spreadsheet that shows that if we tried to do 25 affordable units, it just wouldn't work. That's the gap down there, 7.7 million. So what I always did with the students was just played this exercise. Like, okay, well, how do we make it feasible? So we can lower the unit size, the famous micro units. We can lower the operating expenses, right? Maybe it's energy efficient. Maybe we only have one staff person. Maybe we have cameras instead of employees. We can try to lower the interest rate. We can take land out of the equation, right? Maybe the city owns the land. We can use programs that banks might have to have them give us some relief in terms of their underwriting standards, or we can use subsidy. And it still doesn't work, but we can use more subsidy and make it work. So in a lot of markets, we can just do market, right? This is why a developer just does market rate. Why go through all that hassle? Just do market rate apartments. Of course, that creates all sorts of other dilemmas. And so that's why in those projects that I was working on, we try to do mixed income, having the market rate in some way kind of cross-subsidize the affordable with a lot less subsidy to balance that out. So what I did was I worked with a lot of those programs. I'm sure a lot of you in this room work with those programs as well. And we can think about what the goals we want to achieve are. And in our kind of more neoliberal world we live in today, there's a program for many of these things. But it works mostly through incentivizing developers or through leveraging land or higher rents or market rate housing, which also didn't really work for a lot of the city's legacy cities. We have tax credits, we have new market tax credits, we have historic tax credits, which have been used a lot in Cleveland. All of these things are competitive, and they go nationally, so you're competing nationally for a lot of these resources. And a good project can win, a savvy developer, a really good nonprofit, but it still raises the problem, can you actually solve a housing crisis or create economic development if you're competing every year for these scarce resources, especially with things like sequester and a Congress that might not pass any legislation for a year. So that also got me thinking, well, how can we have an effect in addition to all of these programs that we might have? So just a couple of questions. What can we do in planning and design to create better cities, enhance affordability? How can we package innovation to be legible to lenders and regulatory agencies? Lenders are notoriously risk averse. They like something that's already happened a couple of times. They don't like the new thing. How do we combine design innovation with the financial tools and replicate them? I'm guilty also of doing lots of one-off projects that got published and looked great and will never happen again, and somebody else will cover the next one-off project. So I want to also figure out how you replicate those great projects that you do. And then finally, what would an equity fund look like if you packaged all those things together and created something that actually was replicable? So there are lots of ways to do it. In terms of the financing, the question is who's going to do it? Is it the philanthropic community leading? Is it the banks leading? Is it a policy position? But there are many ways along the spectrum that I think we can look at doing these sort of things. One thing that I was really focused on at Deutsche Bank and then also at Upstate was, if you don't have a market with ever-increasing rents or ever-increasing population, can you look at these things differently? For example, underwriting savings or looking for value in places where people haven't looked for value before. Because you don't always have markets where you're having ever-increasing rents every year or ever-increasing population, which creates more demand for the development. So Syracuse specifically, so these are all the federal expenditures that go to the city of Syracuse. $890 or so million a year in these various categories, and they're contracted, but they're everything from food stamps to Section 8 housing to affordable housing programs to incarceration to other things. So just as a way of starting the thought process, I thought, well, which of these things are we spending money on already, right? $890 million is coming into the city in various ways. Are there ways to redirect those funds towards the better outcomes? Are there ways to redirect some of those funds and then show that the projects are replicable that then bring the lenders on? So those are some of the questions I asked myself. So what I want to do this evening is just go through 5 projects where theoretically that happened, or we tried to make that happen. And I tried to be alliterative, so it's a little, doesn't really work, but I want, once I started with 3 Ps, I wanted to have 5 Ps, so bear with me with this. So parking, which is the bane of my existence in terms of development, because when a parking spot costs anywhere from $20,000 to $40,000 a spot, for me, that's affordable housing that's not being built, or that's retail that's not being built. But I'm a cyclist, so that's also, but I don't hate cars, but anyway, okay. So this is downtown Syracuse, part of downtown Syracuse. And, like many cities, actually, I mean, it's kind of amazing to me that many cities, even if they still have problems, the downtowns are really actually growing and getting new population, which is also happening in Syracuse. So on this site, a new Marriott went in. Next to it, a parking lot. On this site, O'Brien and Gear, which is the biggest engineering firm in town, moved back from the suburbs into town. Parking lot went next to that. The architecture school moved, and the School of Visual and Performing Arts at Syracuse University moved downtown and renovated an old warehouse and built a parking lot next to it. So as I'm looking at this, as I'm riding my bike past this, I'm thinking that's not creating, like, we're getting more buildings, but we're creating a less walkable city with each new building. And if you extrapolate that out, what kind of city do you have once it's actually built out? You have a city of a kind of patchwork city that used to be a city from that other picture, but is starting to look kind of like a suburban office park, right? Where you walk from building through a parking lot to another building, or most likely you get in your car and drive to the next thing. So I thought, well, and also that's development that now can't happen. So with each new building, if a parking lot goes next to each building, what's the issue? So and all of this happened when there was a municipal parking lot right across the street. And I counted and there were empty spaces. But one of the projects we worked on was to think about ways that you wouldn't reduce people's access to parking, but you would change the equation. So the first thing was to delineate a parking district. Not make it the whole city, but particularly downtown, where you want a dense, walkable place. Calculate the surface garage space, manage demand. For me, decoupling parking from buildings. Why should in a city, why should each building be responsible for its parking? That's the way we do zoning, though, right? Residential, 1 or 1.5 spots per unit. Retail has certain parking requirements, even in downtowns. The other thing that we thought was, if somebody's pulling into a parking garage and taking a ticket or using a smart card, why not have automatic enrollment in car share and bike share and have those in the parking garage? And then once you do that, you can measure, right? You put sensors under each parking spot, you know which spots are available and which spots aren't. Maybe you can start capping the parking and trading it to further out parking lots with the bike share or the car share. And then once that happens, 2020, 2025, repurpose the garage for active uses, and then replicate. So Syracuse has the city controls 14,000 parking spots downtown through municipal lots or on-street parking. So the walking distance downtown, you can see it's all very walkable, and even more bikeable. And they even have a website that shows you every parking garage, what it costs, what the spots are. So what we did is we said, okay, so if you put bike share in those garages, and Syracuse is not a city that can support bike share, but if you coupled it with the parking, all of a sudden a small city or a mid-sized city can support bike share because it's integrated with another system. It's not a separate system, it's part of an integrated system. So we looked at bike share in various garages, and then car shares in fewer garages, so that if people wanted to go out during the day, they could, but they wouldn't have to use their car to do it. Less trips, generate less trips. So over time, you could get less parking in the core, where you want buildings, not parking lots, and recover. This is just 3 lots, which were added up to 1,000 spots. The city gets about $300,000 in revenue per year, but the development potential, and downtown can support this now, would be buildings worth about $60 million, and the associated real estate taxes that those would bring. So we just modeled it. The technology is all there. Bike share is there. Car share is already in town. We looked at a building, and when we looked at the parking garages, we also told the city, let's talk about code too. Like, if you're building parking garages, make them slabs with ramps. Don't make raked parking garages, because that's going to be a parking garage for the rest of its life. Whereas these kind of parking garages can actually be converted to other uses. So we looked at converting a garage like this to ground floor retail, still having 2 floors of parking, but then 2 floors of residential. If you had that process in place to cap and trade, and you could actually have the data to say, is our plan actually moving cars out of the center so that we can reclaim those buildings? And it's really important because even outside of downtown, everybody was excited about this new healthcare center that was actually integrated into a grocery store. And so that the card that you use, like a shopper's card, if you elected, also had your medical records and would give you advice on sort of healthy foods to buy or other things, which is a great project. All those buildings were torn down for the parking lot for that building. So and they were all occupied. So I feel like it's a problem that actually could have a solution if we tried to be innovative. And it's not any more money per se. It's just, I think, a different way of thinking about how we utilize our space and how we might employ technology to do that. So playgrounds. This isn't really a playground, it's a street. But we ran a competition called Movement on Main, which is a misnomer because that's Wyoming Street, but Movement on Main made sense. Downtown's just on the other side of that kind of wide street. And this is one of the poorest census tracts in the city with very bad health outcomes and a high poverty rate. And you can probably recognize the public housing on the left-hand side of the left-hand side of the street. But Syracuse is actually under a consent decree to mitigate stormwater. Community groups sued maybe 10 or 15 years ago because the city was going to build a stormwater treatment plant in the poor neighborhood, which was an issue of environmental justice, and they won. And the city decided that it should actually mitigate stormwater all over the city instead of having it all flow into a $600 million plant, which meant the streets were being torn up and porous paving and bioswales and everything else. So what we did with this was we said, if you're tearing up the street anyway, in this neighborhood with poor health outcomes and a lack of parks, why not actually make it a play street that also mitigates the stormwater? So we did a competition for landscape architecture firms to come in, and we picked one, but it ran the kind of 8 blocks of that street. And the notion was to use the money already allocated for stormwater mitigation from the Department of Transportation, augmented with funding from a couple of foundations. And the Housing Authority donated its kind of excess land. As you know, many Housing Authority properties are kind of on super blocks with green space that isn't really used. So they actually dedicated some of their green space to this, to expand the area. But it is going to happen. There was a little more money to be raised, and the schedule for this street to be redone with porous paving and bioswales is going to take a while, but that actually gave us the opportunity to run the competition and then also build interest and get the community engaged in how they might want the street to look. So they helped us evaluate the 5 landscape architecture firms that came together. And it also let us prototype part of it. So the winning design was from Stoss, Landscape Urbanism, with these kind of places that were benches, but like soft surfaces. And we, in a lot on the street, built a prototype of it so that this day, like about 400 junior high school kids came and tested it for us to see how it would work. But what I liked about it was it actually just got people playing sort of inadvertently, right? Walking down the street became a reason to play, a place to sit, a place for people to hang out. So hopefully it will get built. And it leverages that infrastructure money in a way that really does much more. It's much more performative than just green infrastructure. This is a smaller project, but the city parks all have these kind of bunkers, like equipment sheds. So we said, what if you opened those up? And we did one bunker and opened it up in certain ways to have sort of like bathrooms, sort of tennis racket rental, some community space for the weekends when people barbecue in the park so that they could get supplies there. But it became a prototype for the 22 sort of bunker-like sheds in all the parks. They were planning on redoing them anyway, so we said, well, why not make it more than just a concrete bunker? Why not make it better? So one was done. Hopefully that then becomes a model for the rest. Prisons, which is the next one, is even a bigger issue now than it was 2 years ago when we started this project. I don't know if people are familiar with $1 Million Blocks, which is Laura Kurgan at Columbia's project, but she looked at data and found that there were certain blocks in New York, less in other cities, but in certain blocks in New York, between parole, incarceration, reincarceration, $1 million a year was being spent on those blocks. And it's a problem. I mean, to be blunt, I think New York State was using incarceration as an economic development strategy. And they were shipping people upstate. So if you got arrested in New York City and sentenced, you would be sent 400 miles away to upstate New York. And what that did was, it's almost impossible for families to visit their relatives. A lot of the prisoners, when they get released, just end up moving up there because their families moved up there to be closer to them. So luckily, now we're in a place where that strategy has shifted. They're closing those prisons. The incarceration rate is much lower now. But you still have this issue of formerly incarcerated people that are kind of reincarcerated in the sense that it's incredibly hard to get housing and jobs with a criminal record. And all this money is being spent on parole and on transportation and all these other things. So in, I'm sorry, it's so hard to read, but this is where people are released. So even though many of the people were arrested and tried in New York City, they go to prisons in upstate New York and they're released and they usually stay up there. But they find it very hard to get employment and housing. So a nonprofit called the Center for Community Alternatives, which is looking for alternatives to incarceration and also sentencing reform. They actually just did an announcement, I think today, with the HUD secretary saying that he'll enforce fair housing for landlords that deny people housing on the basis of conviction. But they, with the Syracuse Housing Authority, they got the Syracuse Housing Authority to agree to what they call ban the box, like get rid of the box that says, do you have a criminal conviction? Because if you've served your time, you've served your time. And also thought about creating housing development for a reentry population that was integrated with family housing and affordable housing. So this is also a case where we ran a competition, getting architects to think, okay, well, there are actually issues for families in terms of will they locate in housing with the formerly incarcerated. And that's a kind of psychological problem, but it's also a design question. How do you make people feel comfortable? How do you make the formerly incarcerated feel included? How do you create job opportunities with the housing? How do you make it accessible to retail and jobs? So we had the architecture firms look at that. We helped the Housing Authority pick a site. They owned a fair amount of land. So we helped them pick a site that was, this is Syracuse University here, just 2 blocks away, and downtown's 2 blocks that way. And this is on a bus route. And the Housing Authority owned the land outright, and it wasn't contaminated, so that seemed like a good site. And you can't read that either, but it basically says shelter units, transitional units, 1, 2s, and 3 bedrooms, in addition to community space and supportive service space, and then a small retail space for a local grocery. And so we put this out to the architecture firms in the form of an RFP, and they came back with some really interesting ideas about how you make those connections and what flows could happen in terms of how you create experiences to get to outcomes. So we also engaged the students and had a design charrette so that they could learn from the architecture firm. So part of the RFP is that, okay, you're going to have some students embedded with you in this process. So we created a short list, and then 4 firms competed for the prize. We also, I'm very happy to say, paid all the architecture firms for their work, which I think is important. But we also made them all have a winter rendering, because we're in this part of the world. But it was a really interesting exercise and has informed the project, which is now out trying to get financing. But the site's secured, the architect's on board, there's a third-party developer, and it'll be 56 units with about 13 units for reentry populations. And the competition was partially funded actually by the Department of Justice, Federal Department of Justice, that's looking for alternatives to incarceration now, which is great. So this is another one of the schemes. But thinking about how you have a kind of interior space but exterior space, public space, how those 2 populations mix. You actually have social services with a parole officer on site, which was found to greatly reduce parole problems, because a lot of the problem is people traveling to parole officers. So to have somebody dedicated on site apparently is really important. So I'm running through these quickly, but I figure we'll have time to talk afterwards, have a discussion. So public ways, this is the one that doesn't make sense, but I needed a P. And this might be familiar to you as well. You might be surprised to learn that that highway destroyed an African-American neighborhood in the 50s, and about a quarter of downtown as well. The good thing is it's reached the end of its useful life. It's an elevated structure that splits the university from downtown. And so the question is, do you rebuild it? Does it come down, or do you do something else? And it really looked like it was going to get rebuilt. Luckily, we came very early in the process. But this was built in the 60s, and apparently the new federal standards have larger lane widths and larger turning radii for the ramps. So if it was to be taken down and rebuilt, it would then take over. Basically, the ramps would like have to curve around, not like this, but all the way around, and take out, I think they said 70 to 90 more buildings, including 13 historic structures. So kind of like re-assaulting the neighborhood. And they had a public process, but it just, I don't know, there were too many Post-its and too much engineering speak. And people didn't really understand what was happening. It seemed very opaque. So we ran a process, design studio with the architecture students, integrated with a real estate seminar so that we could understand, if you took down this expressway, what's the value you're creating by reclaiming the land. We had an exhibition of ideas, and then we invited the AIA New York chapter to come and do a charrette with the community, the students, and also actually the transportation officials that we didn't think were doing such a great job. I think they are inclined to think of things in terms of how fast a car can go from point A to point B, and not necessarily the communities they're going through. So in this process, we just tried to create more information. So this was the neighborhood that the expressway went through. So just to sort of elevate the history of that and talk about what was lost and what was there and why. Because of course it's a phenomenon that's happened all over the country. This isn't unique, right? It happened in just about every city. But I think we were lucky in that it's not a decision that just gets made. Like, it's reached the end of its useful life. Something has to happen. But this is, you can see from 1875 to 2010, the population decline, mostly because that expressway not only tore out the neighborhood, but then like expressways do, everything around it. So all the land lost value on the 2 blocks on either side as well. And then I think one of the most powerful images, so this is downtown in 1940 or so, and that's it now. And I think that was surprising to people. Not just the fact that you lost so many buildings, but that you lost really an urban fabric and you got this kind of super blocking of the city. So, it's just a very different place when you have individual homeowners and individual businesses and you go to that. And then you can also see that there was this is one of the oldest public housing sites in the country, and they ran it through there. So half of the public housing is actually almost under the elevated expressway, and the other half is on the other side. The other side. We knew we were going to get pushback from the transportation people, and the people in the suburbs actually put out an ad saying, "You can't tear down our main street," calling the interstate their main street. So we said, we're going to get precedents from highway teardowns all over the country, and we're not just going to tell you the precedents and show you the pretty pictures, but we're going to say, how does the population match up to Syracuse? What are the vehicle counts compared to Syracuse? So that they couldn't come back and say, well, of course that happened in San Francisco or Portland or someplace else. So we tried to be methodical about how we did it. And then showed sort of befores and afters of other cities. And then the students looked at ways, even, because we wanted to be even-handed. I'm not sounding even-handed now, but we were, at the time, very even-handed. So we did a rebuild scheme. Like, if you rebuild the expressway, how do you make it the best rebuilt expressway that connects a community you can? If you replace it, are there ways you can create economic development, even with a expressway? Reusing it, so maybe like taking it down to 1 or 2 lanes or reusing the steel. This is what the boulevard that the SMTC, the transportation agency, came up which scared people. Saw this and they said, why not just keep the highway up? Because that's ridiculous. I would never want to cross that street. And it just creates the same condition, just at grade, not above ground. And so we decided we had to, and this was just kind of presented to people. So they actually had a rebuild option, which they said was infeasible because it would cost almost as much as replacing it. And then this was their boulevard option, but it was clearly put out there to say, you don't want a boulevard, because look, it's going to be 8 lanes wide, and you're still going to have parking lots.